Adverse childhood experiences. So just a reminder that the whole context of understanding and learning about adverse childhood experiences is to help us develop the way that we provide trauma-sensitive care to our children and youth, right? So again, kind of trauma-sensitive care, there is no specific kind of like therapeutic intervention or therapeutic modality. There's no kind of like best practice that says this child has experienced trauma, so therefore A, B, C, D, it must happen. Instead, trauma-sensitive care encourages us to, outside of the behavior and outside of the experiences that we may have with those child or youth, instead, it encourages us to see that child for the sum of experiences and sum of strengths that they are, right? So it's knowing that each child has their own unique history, and from that have developed their own unique challenges as well as their own unique resiliencies. And knowing that, the question then becomes, what can we do as caregivers to best support those individual needs, given that we understand kind of the complex natures that those children and youth come into our homes with, right? Okay, so quick review. Session 1 summary. I'm just gonna go kind of over the main points. I've added PowerPoints that go into a little bit more detail so that you do have them to reference at a later date if you feel you need to. But just kind of reminding you about the pair of ACEs. So adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma is not isolated necessarily just to the family of origin, right? So when we look at those adverse childhood experiences, or when we think of childhood trauma, we think of, you know, substance abuse in the home, or we think of domestic violence, or emotional, physical, sexual abuse, right? There's kind of that spectrum or that gamut of traumatic experiences that we would, you know, kind of necessarily assume that a child may have experienced. But the other piece that's just equally as important to remember, if not more important to remember, is that the community environment that that child is being raised in has equal weight, right? So when we look at the pair of ACEs, so the experience of trauma within the home and the experience of trauma within the community, it's important to note that when those traumatic experiences are left unsupported, those who have experienced that trauma are more likely to experience that kind of spectrum of negative adult outcomes, right? And that impacts us behaviorally, physically, our mental health, our well-being, adverse community environments. So that's, again, kind of what's going on within the community, experiences of you know, poverty or racial discrimination, housing insecurity, food instability. Experiences often exacerbate the likelihood of a child experiencing trauma within the home. So we know that if caregivers are feeling stressed because they're not able to pay rent, or because they're not able to bring food into the home, and then, you know, on top of that, there's underlying substance abuse, we know that the likelihood that those traumatic experiences will be exacerbated or will be heightened are pretty high, right? The other point, though, the important point, is to recognize that ACEs are not set in stone. So that adverse childhood experience study that we reviewed in that first session, it's not destiny, right? So instead, to look at that ACEs study as a framework for understanding developmental trauma and its impacts, but not as a definition that this then is what will happen for this individual through throughout the rest of their life. Okay, trauma and brain development. So again, exposure to that pervasive or that chronic exposure to childhood trauma keeps the brain stuck in survival mode, right? So when the brain is constantly stuck in survival mode, it's stuck in that lower part of the brain. We're kind of stuck in our brain stem. So when all of the attention or all of the time is spent there, it impacts the brain's ability to neurally develop into that kind of mid limbic part of the brain, which is responsible for our attachment, which is responsible for our emotional and our behavioral regulation, as well as the higher neural processes in our cortical brain. And that's responsible for, again, kind of like our higher thinking, our ability to understand and rationalize our self-identity or self-esteem. When we're looking at then supporting these processes, understanding that by the very nature of having children or youth in our home, that their brain has been impacted neurodevelopmentally by their experiences, it's important to understand then that we must first start where the trauma occurred, right? So this is, again, kind of getting into the academics of it, but this was called that neurosequential model. So it's starting from the bottom up. So we're not going to go right to their higher kind of cortical brain when we're seeing behaviors. We're not going to go right to, okay, well, you're really frustrated right now. You're in that stress response again. So let's talk about it. Instead, what we're going to do is meet them from the bottom up. So instead, we're going to look at calming the brainstem, calming that stress response, right? First. And we'll get into that in some more detail throughout this session. Gabor Mate, he's kind of my go-to. If I had a trauma guru, he would be my trauma guru. But my favorite quote by him: trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So just that reminder is, just because the children and youth in our home have been removed from that traumatic environment, whatever that traumatic environment was, does not mean then that experience of living in that kind of activated place of trauma is over, right? So recognizing that trauma, that imprint or that memory of trauma is carried within the body. Again, kind of the body keeps the score. And it really, believing that, it really highlights the importance of having that early intervention and providing that trauma-sensitive care. Okay, so just kind of looking again at this slide kind of focuses on the stress response, right? So looking again at the children and youth in our home, how the reality of how they experience the world, how that would trigger their stress response. So how that would bring them back into that place of fight, flight, or freeze. So first, looking at the left side, we're looking at like what a typical kind of stress response would be, right? So, kind of we're in that green section on the bottom. We're socially engaged, we're calm, we're baseline, we're able to access our language, we're able to speak about how we're feeling or what's going on for us, we're able to be regulated. What happens though is something in our environment will trigger us and we'll start to get dysregulated, start to get frustrated, our kind of parasympathetic nervous system will kick in. So maybe, our heart will start to beat faster or we'll get flushed, right? And we'll move into that flight or fight place if something in our environment is triggering us as a stressor. And we'll stay in that place until that stressor has been removed from the environment, whether it's because we've dealt with the stressor through fight, or we've took off and we've gotten away from the stressor through flight. What happens though sometimes is if we feel like, for whatever reason, or if our brain, I should say, because our stress response isn't a cognitive reaction, we're not consciously aware of how we're responding. It's kind of like a neurological response, right? It's a survival response. What happens is if our brain feels that we're not able to deal with that stressor through fight or flight, we move into freeze. So that's where you have that shutdown, right? That's where you'll have People will be unable to communicate and will look like they're gone. You'll get kind of that flat effect, or the bovine stare is what I call it, where they just kind of stare at you, but they're not there. Or people will turtle up, their body language will tighten up. What happens though, now kind of moving to the next slide, is, with the window of tolerance, kind of the same thing, recognizing that fight or flight on the left, that left image there, is moving into hyperarousal, and freeze would be hypoarousal, just to connect the slides there. But so now we're looking at kind of the window of tolerance, which is essentially kind of that same thing. So it's understanding, again, kind of sitting in the green, we're baseline, right? And sometimes, things will trigger us and we'll kind of bounce between the edges of, the window of tolerance, and we'll start to feel frustrated. But in general, we have the capacity or the ability to self-regulate and to bring ourselves down and to keep ourselves within that window. What happens though, and that's a healthy flow, there's that type of stress, it's generally a healthy stress. It teaches us that we can manage ourselves, right? What happens though is when there's a chronic exposure to traumatic experiences, and when that chronic exposure is left unsupported, the brain, again, this is kind of that brain stem, lower part of the brain, but the brain stays stuck on in that hyper or hypoarousal state. So if you think of a child or a youth that you may have in your care right now, or a child or youth that you may have previously had in your care at some point, it's pretty easy to, with some reflection, to kind of look at this image in the middle here and say, I have a child who is bouncing off the wall, full of energy. So their sympathetic nervous system is kind of stuck on. They're really quick to anger, 0 to 10. They snap to anger. This is the kid that, is yelling and is defensive and, is acting out physically, maybe putting holes in walls or throwing furniture, right? And then there's also that attitude, you know what, screw you. I don't care. That's a child whose brain is stuck. Their stress response is to be stuck in hyperarousal because there's been kind of that conditioned experience that as a defensive mechanism, I need to stay in this place because historically, through these traumatic experiences, being in hyperarousal is what keeps me safe. Same with hypoarousal, the opposite. This is your child who is really lethargic, right? Who's kind of almost like Eeyore, right? Kind of low energy, flat effect. So not really emotionally responding to anything, kind of numb or seems to lack feeling. They're always tired. They're slow moving. They kind of check out or seem to space out a lot. This is the child or the youth who has, through their experience, learned that, you know what, there's no point in trying to fight this. So I just give up. I'm just going to give up. It is what it is. I'm just going to give up. Right. So looking at this last image here, the survival loop, again, kind of bringing up hypervigilance, which is kind of that where the brain moves into a place of kind of being similar to an overactive smoke alarm. So recognizing first that, in hypervigilance, the brain is always scanning the environment for threat, right? And again, unconscious. This isn't a conscious thing. This is a conditioned defensive mechanism that the brain has developed that says, I have had X amount of traumatic experiences. So I have learned that I need to constantly be in hypervigilance, scanning my environment for a risk of threat, right? Hypervigilance. So what happens is there's that first kind of dot at the top where there's that hyper alert to danger, that hypervigilance. So then what happens is something in the environment cues the brain to say, you're in danger. And sometimes, it can be a danger cue. So for example, a child who has previously been sexually abused, seeing their abuser in the community, right? There's your danger cue. The brain is saying, yep, this is where my trauma has been in the past. This is where I've been in danger. So now we're going to go back into that place and recognizing that this is a dangerous person for me. Sometimes though, it's not necessarily a danger cue. It's a normal cue, right? So instead of the actual person or the actual abuser, it could be somebody, like I had mentioned in the last session, who walks by that wears the same jacket as their abuser does, right? And the brain doesn't discriminate between when it comes to safety, between a normal cue or a danger cue, right? So that regardless, when there's a perceived threat, whether it's real or not, the brain immediately moves into that protective stress response. So again, usually unconscious, the brain kind of goes into the stress response where that child will, usually kind of without really understanding it or seeing what's going on for them, they'll move into fight, flight, or freeze, right? And we're like, what happened here? Like, I don't get it. All we see is a child acting out behaviorally, right? So it can be really confusing to witness. So we've moved into that stress response. And then what happens is when that child is in that stress response, again, because that stress response is held in the lower part of the brain, in the brain stem, in that part of the brain that's responsible for a survival response, we don't have, or that child does not have access then to that higher part of the brain, that cortical part of the brain. So they cannot take in information. We cannot sit there and say, hey, you know what? You throwing the chair, not okay. Their brain is so overwhelmed by feelings of threat that the brain isn't paying any attention to what you're saying. Right? All it knows is that there's threat. So all it's focused on is what can I do to remove myself from this threat. The other piece that's kind of important too is that, and I don't know if I mentioned this in that last session, but when there is that trigger in the environment and when a child does move back into that stress response, it's often accompanied by a sensory flashback. So when I talk about that, I mean that there is a physiological or there is a bodily reaction to the environment with no ability to understand it. And then there's also no ability to communicate it. There's no language attached to kind of that physical memory. So what you often see is a child eventually will come out of that stress response. And then later, when they're calm and you say, what happened for you? They won't be able to connect the dots because there's no language to that memory, particularly if their traumatic experiences happened before language was present. So we're talking about, infants and toddlers at this point, right? Kind of as that language development is coming on. So just, kind of in summary, remembering that at the end of the day, when it comes to trauma, the body keeps the score. So it's not the traumatic experience that impacts us, or impacts those who have experienced developmental trauma. It's the way that the body keeps the score following those traumatic experiences that we need to focus on. Kind of summarizing that first session then, it's remembering that when we are supporting or caring for, the children and youth that we have in our home, that the intervention or the support that we provide is scaffolded, right? So again, kind of looking at that kind of neurosequential model of supports, it's, first thing before anything is we want to calm the brainstem. We want to calm that stress response. And then over this session and the next session, we'll look to understand, okay, then how do we calm that limbic brain, that kind of middle brain that's focused on attachment and behavioral emotional regulation. And then finally, once that is calmed, how do we support, working with the cortical brain? How do we then support, language and executive function? How do we then support, self-esteem and identity? So the way to do that, and I mean, you could all just jump off of Zoom right now and call it a day and not be here next session. At the end of the day, right, the most important part and what we can do supporting our children and youth is regulate. If we as caregivers are unable to regulate our own emotions and help co-regulate the emotions of the children and youth in our home, then there's absolutely no way that we're going to be able to support that stress response that our children and youth are having. Therefore, it's unrealistic to have or to expect any changes behaviorally. If we're coming in and we are, through our own emotions and behaviors, are exacerbating that stress response and not supporting it to become regulated, we cannot expect behaviors to change. So looking at kind of this middle image here, this is kind of what we went over a little bit in that first session, was looking at kind of that developmental trauma from the brainstem, that primitive brain, with kind of a focus on brainstem, calming the brainstem calmers, which I didn't really have a whole lot of time to get through in that last session, but I did leave the slides with you. And those are just ideas of building in opportunities throughout the day proactively, before you see a behavior come up, to help calm the brainstem, to help reinforce to the brain, essentially, because again, it's an unconscious process, that child or youth is no longer in an environment where they're unsafe, right? So again, kind of that biggest support that we can give outside of regulation is maintaining that safe, consistent, and healthy home environment, right? That's the number one thing that's going to help calm that brainstem, calm that stress response, so that knee-jerk move into that stress response becomes diffused. For session 2, we're going to now look at how do we support that second kind of area of the brain, here highlighted in green on your screen, the limbic part of your brain. And again, this is the area of your brain that's associated with attachment and emotional and behavioral regulation. So just really briefly looking at, kind of examples of some of those impacts of, experiencing developmental trauma, as the brain scaffolding kind of is centered around the limbic brain. This is where you're going to see, again, your child or youth be really clinging, very anxious. You see it in drop-offs or daycare, drop-offs at school. Oppositional, the kid that's always kind of speaking back. Rejecting of relationship, distrustful of relationship, or again, overly compliant, remembering kind of back to our stress responses. That's the child that's fawning. I don't want to trigger you into anger, so instead I'm going to be overly compliant, or I'm going to fawn, walk on eggshells to not exacerbate, any situation with you. There's a loss of expectancy of protection by others. So I don't trust people to meet my needs, or I don't trust people to keep me safe. Heightened emotions. So this is that emotional regulation, anger, rage, fear, sadness. The other side, excitement, joy, happiness, just like a huge spectrum of emotions, and really big emotions, big feelings. Or the other side of it, like very deadened emotions, flat affect, numbness, low mood. This is also, and what you see very commonly too, is the, running and hiding, for sure. These are the kids that go AWOL, or these are the kids that bolt. or these are the kids that hide under furniture, kind of depending on how old they are, as well as that self-harming and aggression. So sometimes, depending on how much information you have on that child or youth, kind of on what their history has been, something that does come up often but gets missed is a child recreating those traumatic situations. And that can be really confusing, right? Because you have a child and you're like, this is really traumatic. Like, why are you putting yourself in a situation where you're villainizing me, let's say, right? Like as your caregiver, like you're really putting me in that place where I'm this horrible, abusive, emotionally, destructive person for you. And that's, I just want to care for you. I just want to kind of bring you in, right? Like why is that sabotaging, destructiveness there? That's just kind of one example. There's a whole spectrum, but that's what it ties to, recreating those traumatic situations. And that's being in a trauma loop, right? That's being stuck in that trauma. So then the question becomes, I'm one ahead, hold on a second. So then kind of looking at that neurosequential model, again, starting from the bottom and working our way up. The last session we were looking at, okay, what can we do to, what can we do to regulate that child's fight, flight, or freeze? So again, that's kind of brainstem commerce. What can we do to help calm the brain? This is outside of kind of that immediate, we're dealing with a behavior. This is proactively, what can we do to calm the brain, right? Some ideas. So now we're gonna look at, kind of in this next step, this next scaffolded stage, we're going to look at, okay, what can we do to support, the building of a relationship, or what can we do to support attachment bonds? What can we do to regulate emotions, where like, kind of targeting that emotional regulation place. Co-regulating big emotions. This is the holy grail, like I said, kind of everything I tell you. There's a whole bunch of tips and tricks and best supports and best practices, and we'll go through those things. But at the end of the day, again, and I'm going to keep saying it this whole session, regulation, particularly for our kiddos who, continue to experience trauma, up until, like elementary age, let's say. So if you have a kid who's been in that home or been in that home environment where there's been that experience of trauma, and say that they've, continued to be in that traumatic experience until, early elementary, this is huge, right? And even if they're teenagers then, right, even if they're teenagers now, if their history was that they were continuing to experience that trauma, while that kind of limbic brain was kicking in, then we know that there's going to be some impacts there, right? Because it's not your kids, just kind of, it's important to remember your children and youth, they may be a certain age, they may be 17. So we would expect them then to have kind of that developmental process, lined up what we would expect a 17-year-old to have, but that's not the case, right? We know that the brain gets stuck at that developmental age that the trauma was experienced, right? Okay, co-regulating big emotions. So children learn to regulate their emotions through co-regulation. The better we can soothe them when they are agitated or support them when they are low, the better they can absorb how to do this for themselves. Now that we're all neuroscientists and understand neurodevelopmental trauma, I'm kind of give you a really great example, and feel free to carry along with me here if you want to. But I use kind of this image as a reminder. So here we've got your kiddo's brain, right? Here we've got the brain stem, right? Sitting like at the very bottom by the spine. Up here, we've got our limbic brain, which is again, emotional, behavioral regulation and attachment. And then kind of like wrapped around all of that, we've got the cortical brain, which is like our higher thinking processes. So when everything is all good and functioning, right, and we're all baseline and relaxed and within our window of tolerance, this is, you know, what our brain looks like, da, 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 da. What happens though, when a child gets triggered is they flip their lid. So really easy way of understanding when that lid is flipped, those three brain processes are disconnected. Particularly the higher part of the brain, that cortical part of the brain, is completely disconnected from that limbic part of the brain. So our language and our rationalization are completely disconnected from our emotions and our behaviors. So our responsibility then through co-regulation is to bring the brain back together.
This is Sylvia. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the recreation of trauma, I'm wondering if like say a teen who was abused as a child, their recreation would be like risky promiscuity. I'm just wondering if that's like connected.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You see that a lot in teens who have a history of sexual abuse. That's been left unmitigated. So when I say unmitigated, I mean that there's been no kind of like targeted intervention or support that's been available to that teen up to that point. So what happens is, and kind of we'll get into it as we move forward into that kind of cortical brain session, which is next session, I believe. But what happens is for a child who's sexually abused, is there is kind of like a identity that's developed around their genitals, right? There's an identity that's developed around who they are in connection to their genitals. And kind of the maladaptive way that manifests is relationship or attachment, that sense of I am wanted, I am needed, I am belonging is attached to their genitals, right? Does that kind of make sense?
She said, thank you.
Oh, okay.
Anna, yeah. I have a question.
Yeah.
My foster daughter scoots under her bed when she's heightened, and I have a condo, not a lot of storage, and typically I keep storage bins under the beds, but I haven't done that in her room. Mm-hmm. I just feel like, I want to make sure if she's doing that, she's safe under there. Yeah. Do you think it's best to just leave that space under her bed empty? Or should I be, trying to figure out another way to help her get regulated? Because that's always my goal, is to help her get back down to her baseline so we can problem solve together.
Yeah. And that's a really good question, Mary. Like, thank you for asking. So the question was, when we have a child to kind of move into a stress response, what can we take away kind of what that defensive mechanism or what that behavior is kind of tied to that stress response, and trying to teach them a new way in managing that feeling, right? Is that kind of what you're
Yeah. I want her to come and have a cuddle or talk. Sure. I want to teach her a healthier way and to rely on me to help her calm down.
Yeah. So I think it's and I think it's important to kind of acknowledge, and you've acknowledged this, is that when a child has a behavior that's tied to their stress response, and in this example, it's a child that's hiding under their bed, that behavior is a defensive mechanism. So somewhere along the lines, the child that's in your home has learned that the best way to keep herself safe is to hide. So I would be really very wary or very cautious about removing that behavior, because that is a safety-based behavior for her. So what you would likely see is, if you were to remove that safety behavior, that defensive behavior, without giving her another opportunity that she's learned will keep her safe, you're going to see behavior, you'll see it exacerbates the behavior. You'll see that behavior heighten, because now, without being able to hide under her bed, what do I do? What will keep me safe? So you'll see, you know, even more escalation. What I would maybe recommend instead, and it sounds like that's kind of what you've already done, which is great, is allow that, you know, as long as she's safe, which she is, you know, being under the bed, allow her to kind of continue into that place. But maybe, you know, the kind of alternative is, you know, instead of like hiding under the bed, we're going to create, you know, like a calm down space, or like a safe space. So maybe like in the corner of your room, I'm going to put a pop-up tent up, and I'm going to fill that pop-up tent with blankets, and I'm going to fill it with pillows. So if you feel like you need to run somewhere safe, this is your safe place.
Great.
Okay? But, you know, kind of outside of that, whether you're changing the location of her hiding or not, it could also, and it should also kind of at the same time, there should be focus on like, you know what, like you're feeling, and we'll get into this in later slides, but like, you know, you look like you're feeling, you know, scared right now. And you're safe, you're okay. You know, I'm here, like, and providing that space, right? And eventually over time, and understanding that in the brain, again, understanding that she's no longer in that place of needing to hide to be unsafe. So by providing those opportunities to co-regulate it and be safe, you'll see that stress response will minimize, right? And that may still be that she goes under the bed, but maybe, you know, instead of an hour under there, you know, in full light mode, maybe instead she's under there for 2 or 3 minutes, and then she comes out.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, she's growing quickly. I'm worried she's going to get stuck under there.
And you know what? And maybe that is the conversation. And you know, a lot of kids in particular will respond to that. You know, I know you're going under the bed because you want to feel safe. So let's together, not just me doing it for you, but let's together, you know, decide on, you know, what that safe space, you know, cuddle corner, whatever you want to call it, you know, what that calm down space or that safe space looks like for you. Let's get you a tent, and, you know, let's go to the store, and together we'll buy the blankets, and together we'll buy the pillows. And maybe you love to read, so let's throw some books in there too.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Kind of the focus of this session, not Gabor Mate, but Bruce Perry, who is another really incredible kind of forefront thinker on developmental trauma. His quote: "Trauma has happened in the relationship, so therefore the healing must happen in a relationship." Again, trauma has happened in the relationship, so therefore the healing must happen in a relationship. So to expect a children or youth to be able to go through those processes of healing, right, through, you know, through their spectrum of life, I guess, to expect them to go through that healing in isolation of others isn't going to work, right? We have to heal kind of in relation and through relationship with other people. The beautiful thing about co-regulation too is co-regulation kind of spans a lifetime, right? Like our focus is on children and youth and like, what can we do to co-regulate? But like, you know, think of as an adult, if you're having a really crappy day or like something, you know, really heavy has happened for you in your life. I know I really like to just kind of knee jerk to pajamas and ice cream, but it also really helps to have, you know, another person there in the room that you know, love and trust come in and give you like a big hug, right? So like this co-regulation piece, yes, it's great for our children and youth, but it's something that, you know, you kind of carry along across the lifetime. Whoop, there we go. I'm wondering, has anybody heard of the 3 R's, Bruce Perry's 3 R's? Yeah, you've got some familiarity. Great. All right, awesome. So this is going to be more of a reminder than anything then. again, this is kind of, the 3 R's are based off of the premise or off of kind of understanding that if when a child or when a teen or when an adult, you know, a significant other who's maybe kind of losing their mind a little bit, when they're in a place when there's an emotional reaction of some sort happening or a stress response happening, therefore we are seeing, what we're seeing is the behavior, that if we as a response to that behavior head straight for the reasoning part of the brain, it's not going to work, right? Because again, we flip the lid so that language piece, that rationalization, is not connected to our ability to emotionally or behaviorally regulate. It's disconnected. First one, we are going to regulate the brainstem. We'll go through the examples on the right. The way that this is set up is kind of more developmentally appropriate to a child, but you can amend it or tweak it to a youth, right? So first of the 3 R's is regulate. So we're looking at regulating our brainstem first, but also regulating the midbrain, right? So we're looking at kind of that sensory survival part of the brain. And what regulation does is it helps the child to calm that stress response, right? To calm that fight, flight, or freeze. And we do that through modeling. We do that through co-regulation. So some ways of offering regulation are encouraging the somatosensory experiences. So that's bodily movement. Those are the big body movements, right? So maybe that is, you know, kind of going back to your example, Mary, maybe that's in your pop-up tent, there's a weighted blanket. Weighted blankets are huge. And when I was first introduced to them, I thought they were kind of hippy dippy, but the weighted blanket provides incredible sensory feedback in the same way that a hug provides that sensory feedback, right? Or any kind of rhythmic or repetitive activity. So maybe it's like, you know what, you're really upset right now, let's go for a walk. Or, you know, you're really upset right now, let's, you know, go out on the swing. Or, you know, for a teen, I know a teen who has learned through support of his caregiver that when he's losing his mind, he takes off and he goes on like a multi-hour bike ride, which at first was terrifying. The caregiver's like, oh my God, like he's taking off on his bike. I don't know where he went. Like, do I call into after hours? What do I do? But sure enough, you know, like an hour and a half, 2 hours later, when that teen comes back, he's super calm because he's had that big body movement and that rhythmic repetitive movement as a way to release some of that pent up, you know, energy, and his energy, his stress response was fight, right? Kind of again, off of that kind of top down reassurance. So we're not going to be like, you know, what's going on for you? Like, that is not okay how you're acting. And, you know, be kind of punitive in the way that we connect with them, or even kind of exploratory and let's talk about this right now. We're not going to start there. Instead, we're going to, you know, say things like, you know, like, you're safe, particularly for our kiddos in care. You know what? You're feeling A, B, C, D, you're feeling really angry right now. You're safe. That's it. You're safe. You're okay. You're safe. You're safe. You're safe. You're safe. That I talked to a young woman in her 20s a couple of weeks back, and we were talking kind of about all of this stuff. And she was saying that, you know, she had a whole kind of gamut of caregivers over the years. She had been in care since she was 6, up until the age that she aged out. And she was saying that of all of the caregivers, there was one caregiver who she ended up eventually staying with until she aged out. There was one caregiver who really kind of met her where she was at. So who really actually kind of had that trauma informed approach and had that trauma sensitive care. And the number one thing that caregiver did for her That was in contrast to the other caregivers who would kind of lose their mind when she was in her stress response, is that caregiver would say, you're safe, right? And be like, you know what, you're not in trouble, it's okay, you're mad, right? The relational tools, you know, on the next, kind of that next point there, it's talking about, you know, reflective listening and, you know, clarifying questions. That's sort of under the assumption that, that's kind of under the assumption that that child or youth who's in that stress response has the ability to, has maybe not fully like moved into a full-fledged stress response, but is still kind of sitting within their dysregulation, which, I mean, that's great if you can catch them at that place where they're just about to move into their stress response. But I find that that relational piece is really challenging with our kiddos in care, because that window between being kind of with, you know, being calm and within their window of tolerance and moving into that place of being in a full stress response, that window is very small. So if you try to, you know, do that reflective listening or, you know, clarifying questions or any of that stuff while they're already in the stress response, you've already lost them, right? So I'm just mindful of that. This is a huge one, practice disassociation. So at the end of the day, and it can be really hard for us to do, I know that I really struggle with, you know, allowing my 4.5-year-old to kind of go off and have his little meltdown. But one of the biggest kind of tools that you have in your toolbox, in your regulation toolbox, is let it happen. If your child or your youth is having a stress response meltdown, sometimes the best thing to do is just to sit back. Again, you're safe, and to hold space. Just hold space. I'm here. Just sit down like a couple feet away from them, or sit down outside of their door, or you know, whatever, like, so that you're still in the line of vision to make sure that they're safe and that they're okay. But you're just going to sit and hold space and allow them to kind of go through that heightened emotion and then to come down. And what that does is it shows them that they're no longer in that traumatic environment because you're not responding in a traumatic way through, you know, anger or yelling or, you know, kind of punitive measures that exacerbates the behavior. But you're also slowly teaching them, or slowly teaching the brain, that it can go through that process. It can hit that heightened emotion in that stress response, but it also can kind of calm down and balance itself out, right? So we'll get into it a little bit further, but like, this is part of kind of our self-esteem. I know through that I can go and I can be triggered by life, and I can be triggered by emotions, and I can be triggered by overwhelming big feelings. But I also am now learning how to bring myself down and how to regulate through that, and that I'm okay. I'm okay after that stress response. It's not the same as it was historically for me. Another huge one, and this is, you know, only obviously if you have children, but just making sure that, you know, as you're standing there, you're not standing over top of them. And it sounds like a really small thing, but recognizing that the likelihood that child has experienced abuse at the hands of an adult who's significantly taller than them, pretty high, right? And when an adult comes into your personal, you know, into a child's personal space, particularly a child that has experienced trauma, you know, when an adult comes in and is, you know, a huge kind of presence in a child's bubble, and this is trauma or not, right? It can be really overwhelming because that the sheer size and the sheer height of that person implies a huge power imbalance. So it shows that child just by your proximity that they are not in control. And for children who have experienced trauma, it basically kind of says, I'm also not safe. So kind of getting down low and crouching down to that child's level, even sitting on the floor, if you're holding space and kind of allowing them to go through that kind of emotional experience, is a huge tool too. This is one for me too, where the last one is kind of let them play, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive to be like, okay, you know, this child just destroyed the room, or this teen just destroyed the room, and now, you know, the teen is grabbing their phone to go on Facebook, or, you know, now this kid is, you know, grabbing their favorite toy and it's, you know, going to play with their toy. And it's our knee jerk is kind of say, well, you know, doing that is reinforcing a behavior, and because, you know, they're getting to do what they want after they just destroy the room, blah, 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 right? And I know, like, I've struggled with that with my own stubborn, strong, powerful toddler. But it's kind of remembering that by allowing your child or youth to play in kind of whatever context or whatever play means for them, is part of kind of that regulatory process, right? It's part of that, okay, self-soothing. I'm going to pick up something that's preferred and I'm going to self-soothe for a little bit. This is going to help me come further down into baseline. The important point to know on this, and particularly kind of in this first of the 3 R's, this regulate piece, is if your child or your youth is acting out in a way that is triggering you, and you are not able to emotionally remain baseline, totally fair, right? Caregiving, parenting is the most triggering experience ever, I think. But if you are finding yourself triggered, your responsibility then is to leave the situation. If you cannot model regulation in that moment, if you cannot model the calm behavior that you're wanting to see from your kiddo, you need to leave, right? You need to go take a break. I put myself, we don't call it timeout in my house, but I say, Landon, I need to take a break and I will leave the room. Because if we come into that situation expecting, you know, our kiddo to like calm down, but we're coming in and we're yelling and we're storming around and we're being angry, right? Like, how realistic an expectation is that? On top of a child who, with their developmental trauma, doesn't have that emotional or that behavioral capacity to do it in the first place. But now we're, you know, kind of putting a double whammy on them by we're, you know, not only not able to model it for them, so we're asking them to do what I say, not what I do, but we're also asking them to, you know, show a neurodevelopmental capacity that they don't yet have. Right? So if you find yourself being triggered by behaviors, which is, nobody's perfect, we all do it, right? The easiest and best thing that you can do for that situation is to go, I need to take a break. You know, I'm just going to go calm myself down. Maybe you don't need to leave. Maybe it's just, you know what? Whatever it is that works for you in that moment, deep breaths. You know, some people are really into tapping. Tapping can be really calming. Whatever it is that you need to do to calm yourself down first, do that. And then come back to the situation and try to do that co-regulation. And then come back to the situation and try to support your kiddo and kind of calming that stress response down. Okay, moving into reason. So 3 R's, we've got regulate. Now we're on to relate. Sorry, I skipped one. Now we're on to relate. So once a kid has gone through that kind of like emotional escalation, right? It's really heavy. Like, that's a really heavy place to be in, particularly again, because a lot of the times our kiddos don't have that cognitive awareness to understand where that emotional response is coming from. Some of them might, particularly if there's been therapeutic intervention where they've seen a counselor or whatever, but a lot of the time they don't. All they know is something has happened in their environment. They got triggered and they blew it, right? But no, again, like, no child wants to be that explosive child. No child wants to go through this huge emotional stress response. It doesn't feel good. Even as adults, it doesn't feel good. When we lose it, it doesn't feel good, right? So when a child comes down off that kind of like emotional mountain, now is not the time to say, well, let's talk about this now, right? Because there's feelings of overwhelm, there's feelings of fatigue, there's probably feelings, you know, that's when kind of those memories of traumatic experiences would come up, you know, maybe shame or guilt in acting out in the way that they did. So instead of overwhelming them by saying, well, let's talk about what happened there, instead, we are going to repair the relationship. Instead, we are going to bring things kind of back together, realign that attachment, realign that relationship by creating opportunities to relate, right? And that's kind of that attuned, kind of sensitive relationship piece. With this, and this is kind of like, again, one of the holy grails, is recognizing that whether or not we understand it, whether or not we feel it's justified, whether or not it's how we would feel or behaviorally how we would manage things, emotions are emotions. There's no justification behind emotions, right? There's no need to validate emotions. Emotions are there. They are organic. They're an intrinsic part of who we are. So we don't question when a child feels emotions, we don't question. It's there. It's a huge part of their being, in the same way that their heartbeat is a natural organic part of their being, right? Emotions are just as intrinsic to, you know, our expression of who we are. So kind of that first thing is, and relating or reconnecting that relationship is, you know, play together. So again, kind of using Mary's example, maybe then, you know, once, you know, her child seems to have calmed down and is reading a book, then Mary asks, you know, can I come in the tent with you and look at the book? Or, you know, do you want to come out of the tent and we can read the book together, right? So we're going to pull in the opportunities to, or, you know, your teen is watching a video on their phone and, you know, you hear it's about dirt biking. It's like, oh, like, are you watching a dirt biking video? Like bringing kind of that opportunity for play back into the relationship, using kind of the language to bond, be like, you know what, like that was really tough. I saw that was really tough for you and I'm proud that you got through it. Again, totally counterintuitive because we parent the way that we are parented, and our generation and the generations above, that's not what we do. We don't hold space for big emotions like that, right? We say, nope, this isn't okay. How you were acting isn't okay. We're not doing this anymore. Totally like flipping the script and pulling a 180 on how we know things. So I acknowledge how hard that is. But kind of that importance of like, that was, I mean, the first couple of times I did it with my own kid, I had to like, that was really hard. I'm so proud that you got through it. Like I had to force the words through my teeth, right? But what's really reinforcing is you see the reaction or the response in your kids, particularly if historically you've been like, da, 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 and then suddenly you flip the script. It's like, what? Like they're like, what is this? You know, and if you have that relationship with your kiddo, a hug is always good. And again, this is very child specific. Some kids, particularly if there's a history of sexual or physical abuse, that's off the table. You know, maybe it's just a hand on their arm, or you know, maybe it's, you know, instead like, you know, here's a, whatever, it could be, look like different things. But if you have that relationship with your child, to kind of go in and give them a hug, or, you know, give some sort of touch, that releases oxytocin, which is that kind of feel good, relaxing hormone, right? It helps kind of calm the nervous system and bring it back down to that kind of baseline relaxed state. And I think too, kind of like really seeing that last point there, like really seeing each other. So, you know, there's different ways to interpret that, but I think what falls within that is really kind of acknowledging and validating with eye contact what that child has just experienced. So again, this is going back to that first session, this is looking underneath the behavioral iceberg, right? Like we see the behavior on top of the water, but through this kind of seeing each other piece or acknowledging or validating what that child has been through emotionally, we're also acknowledging all of those experiences that that child or youth has had leading up to that emotional outburst. So we're acknowledging the rest of what's happening underneath the water, what's the iceberg that's hidden underneath the water. Reason. So we've got regulate, relate, reason. This is our last R. This is kind of the part that everybody waits for. Finally, we get to talk about it, right? So once the child is calm, right? Once they're connected, once you kind of repaired that relationship, then and only then are they able to kind of fully engage then. And let's talk about this. Let's learn about this. So through doing that regulate and relate, we bring kind of that cortical back down over top, and we're able then to do the language piece. Now we're able to talk about it, and only now are we able to talk about it, right? So this is where, you know, you're going to have conversations like, you know, that was like, you were really upset. Like, what happened for you there? We're going to explore first. We're not going to go in and say that wasn't okay, and I didn't like that you did this. This is where we want to acknowledge and validate their emotion, kind of recognizing that it is, again, organic and innate, and we don't need to say one way or another whether we felt it was okay or not. We just want to understand, because through understanding, we're not only saying to you, I see you as a person with lived experience, but we're also showing that child or that youth through our language, I want to do what I can to support you to preventatively or proactively work on having you not get to this place anymore, right? So like, what happened for you? What was that about? That was a really big feeling, right? Or like you know what, if the kid doesn't have language to it, and again, that happens a lot, children who have experienced trauma, particularly kind of at that developmental age when the limbic brain develops, don't have the ability to put language to it. So it could be like, you know, this is what I saw. I saw, you know, you were told, no, you can't have a second serving of dinner. So you know, looked at me and you started crying, and then you ran and you hid under your bed. That's what I saw. But like, what were you feeling? Like, what happened for you there that made you feel upset, right? We're going to explore it and try to understand it more. And a lot of the time that's kind of through asking questions that aren't just necessarily yes or no questions, but it's like, you know, when you were feeling sad, I was feeling really sad. So I really want to help you understand, like, you know, was there something that, you know, was said? Was there something that I said? Or was there something that, you know, Jack, who's also in the home, you know, may have done too? Once you're able to kind of have that discussion and debrief what's happened, that's kind of where that was like, okay, like, are you feeling better about this now? Like, do you feel okay? Kind of doing that kind of reflective piece, just to ensure as you're wrapping it up that everybody is kind of moving forward, not still carrying or holding on to anything. And that kind of, you know, empowering and confidence piece as well too. It's like, you know what, I'm super proud of you. Like, I know that was a huge feeling. You were super upset. You were really angry there. And, you know, you may have, you know, threw the lamp across the room, or you may have, you know, hid under the furniture, or you may have told me off with, you know, a series of swear words or whatever, but we got through it, And I'm super grateful that we were able to, get through it, and that we were able to talk about it. And I'm proud of you, because I know that you're still learning how to do this stuff. So thank you. Again, super hard, because as parents, we're taught we're up here in the chain of power, kids down here in the chain of power, right? But I promise you, if you parent from this place of power, you're not going to see any improvement of behavior. You're constantly going to be engaged in a power struggle, right? You have to meet with a child or a kiddo who has experienced trauma. You have to meet them where they are at neurodevelopmentally, if you want to see those changes in behavior, right?
Anna, I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
If you have done that and you are able to have a really good conversation with the child about what they might have been feeling, what, I might have inadvertently done, I will like, I always feel it's important to apologize to a child.
Totally.
If there's something that I did that made them feel unsafe, or that brought out some big feelings. But is it okay to say, after all of that, have you noticed that in this house, we talk about big feelings? Nobody's yelling. Nobody's going to call you names here, because my little 8-year-old really, really calls me some horrible names. And I'm thinking about, I want her to be socially connected, and all of those things impact her, which of course she doesn't understand. But I typically do say, I want her to notice, in this house, we talk about our big feelings. And no one will call you names here, and no one is going to curse at you. And we all try to do that. We all try to follow those rules.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, like, through these 3 R's, I'm not saying, or I'm hoping anyways, that I'm not coming across that I'm saying, we're not going to have any boundaries for these kids. Yeah. That is, and we're just gonna, every time they have a blow up, we're gonna say, well, let's do the 3 R's and, get through it this way. For sure. Like, that's a great way to respond to those behaviors. But particularly kiddos who are more anxious, or, who have that experience of trauma, those boundaries, or rather having a lack of boundaries, really clear, concise, and consistent boundaries, actually heightens that feeling of anxiety, right? Because a lot of our kids have been left in a situation where they're responsible for maintaining their own sense of, security. So, from those kids who, again, maybe have parents who, were busy using, so they were making their own meals, or, they were making meals for the younger siblings, or for kids that, have learned that, the way to get out of being sexually abused is to, act out, aggressively or violently, right? Like, we want to set boundaries around those types of things, because that shows the child, who historically has been in kind of a situation, responsibility wise, that, as adults we would carry, because we're responsible for ourselves in those ways. But, when we set those boundaries for kids, we're saying, no, you're a child. You don't have to be responsible for, when you're going to be fed next, or you don't have to be responsible for A, B, C, D, E, or F, right? And part of that, in setting those boundaries, can be like, no, like we do, this is preventatively, so this is before the behavior, but it is having those front-loading conversations, saying, we talk, like you're saying, Mary, we do talk about our big feelings. We do have conversations about our big feelings. And maybe the caveat is, this is maybe something that's new to you and you're learning, and that's okay. But know that those big feelings are safe in our house. And it comes with time. Like, it's not it's not this like overnight, kind of magic shift, right? Like, again, going back to session 1, when we've got these really deeply embedded wheel ruts in the brain, right? It takes time to develop new neural networks or new neural pathways. so that, you know, our kiddos can respond in different ways. So it takes time, and it takes repetition, and it takes routine, and it takes consistency, right? It's kind of like turning the Titanic, but it happens. I promise you it happens. And the most rewarding thing is seeing the shift, you know, and maybe again, like, you know, your kiddo is still hiding, you know, hiding under the bed, but instead of hiding for 2 hours, they're hiding for 5 minutes. So it does come, you just have to trust in the process, you know, kind of understand the magic that you're kind of retraining the brain. The beauty of that kind of neuroplasticity is you're getting kind of deep in those neural pathways, and you're shifting the way that, you know, things historically have been for that child. And it takes time, but it happens.
I have another question for you, Anna.
Yeah.
A caregiver asks, is it okay during the reason part to say, it's okay to have these big feelings. I love you, you are safe, but it is not okay to hit, punch, kick, or whatever the behavior is?
Sure. Yep. I say that to my own kid. I say that to my own kid when he was kind of going through his hitting phase. And for sure, like, again, this, you know, and maybe I kind of miscommunicated as I was going through the 3 hours, but it's not about not having boundaries, right? Like, you need to have those boundaries. And part of those boundaries is kind of laying out what is okay, but also what isn't okay. I think what's important to kind of add to that, and the caregiver with that comment touched on it, is, you know, I appreciate this, you know, it's okay, and you're safe with your feelings, and you're safe with feeling overwhelmed, and this is a safe space. But what isn't okay, the boundary in that is, but we don't do this. The only kind of thing that I might add to that is, you know, again, understanding that a lot of these behaviors are conditioned responses. So this has been over a period of time. They learned that, for example, hitting kind of, you know, can help as a defensive kind of behavior with, you know, kind of whatever emotion or feeling they're going through. So the only thing I might add to that is, you know, instead of hitting me, here's a pillow, right? Here, hit your pillow. Or instead of hitting me, you know, squeeze a stuffy, or whatever the age is, right? I know for teens, what's worked really, really good, punching bags, man. It's like $100 investment, and it can save your drywall. I swear to God, I've seen like huge shifts in caregiver homes when they put punching bags up, right? For those kind of more aggressive kids. But I guess kind of the point is yes, set the boundary for sure, but also at the same time, if the expectation is that they stop something, knowing that it's going to take time for them to stop something like hitting, we have to have a replacement for them. And that could be, you know, it could even be like, what do you want? What can you hit instead? That's what I said to my kid. What can you hit instead of me? So you go, well, I hit my pillows, right? Or I'll punch my bed. And it works, right? But they have to have that replacement offered to them. Does that answer your question okay?
Can I add something else? Hi, it's Judy.
Judy.
I think within creating and clearly articulating the boundaries within the household, you're also modeling how to be successful within those boundaries. And I think so we're modeling regulation, we're modeling building connection, we're modeling reason. And I think coming alongside these kids, whether they're little ones or whether they're teens, is super important in this model of caring for kids as well. So we're creating and clearly articulating what's going to happen in our homes, and then we're showing them, we're accompanying them, and we're modeling them the tools that they need to be successful. And then we're reminding ourselves that they're kids. This is all new to them, right? So if they come into the culture of our home and make some mistakes, then we can help them repair that as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that's like such a valid point, Judy. Judy was just saying that, kind of summarizing that, is where, you know, whether it's kind of in those behavioral situations or, you know, kind of outside of those behavioral situations, is that we're constantly modeling through our actions what we expect in the home, whether we're having conversation around it or not, right? So it's, you know, we're kind of like walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And, you know, that's like such an important piece because, you know, nobody's perfect. We're not perfect. You know, it's totally normal to, you know, fall off, and being consistent, you know, with the way that, you know, we respond to things emotionally, or, you know, not be consistent in some of kind of our expectations. And, you know, Judy, like just kind of like you pointed out too, part of that is recognizing, you know, not only are we not perfect, but our kids aren't perfect. So just being very mindful of the standards that we hold our kids to. You know, again, I feel like one of kind of the common challenges that caregivers I've spoken to anyways over the years have is that there's an expectation that they're going to be able to raise the kiddos in their home in the same way that if they have children, that they've raised their own kids. What kind of comes into conflict with that, though, is obviously the kids that we have in our care haven't had those same early development experiences that our own children have had. So to expect the kids in our home to behaviorally, emotionally act the same way, or respond in the same way that our own children have responded to our parenting is a really unfair expectation. And again, that just kind of highlights the importance of kind of, to Judy's point, and like recognizing that, you know, a lot of the kids, particularly even if they've been in care for, you know, years, you know, when they're in your home, it's not what they've known, right? If if they've had multiple placements, they've had multiple expectations set on them too, right? So everybody makes mistakes, but this is that trauma sensitive care, right? Like this is providing that parenting with that trauma informed lens, is recognizing that we can't raise those kids in the same way that we may be raising or may have raised, you know, our own kids. We really have to meet those kids where they're at and understand that because of their complex histories, they're going to have complex responses to our parenting. Thanks.
Hi, Anna.
Judy, that's a good point. Yeah, hi.
Hi, it's Caroline. I have a question. We have talked about this going on in our home.
Yeah.
What happens when we are in the mall, walking down the street? Yes, I had an incident yesterday. Can you address that?
Yeah, can I ask you, as your child kind of was going through that, was there any kind of safety concerns, like immediate safety concerns?
Well, yeah, like, I mean, we were walking along the sidewalk, and he decided that he didn't want to go to the lights to cross. He wanted to cross the road right there. And I said, no, it's not safe, blah, blah, blah. So he threw his backpack down and stomping his feet. He's 6. And I said, you know, we can't do this here because it's not safe. And he just stood there, held his ground, and crossed his arms. And yes, it was quite the show.
Sounds like my hubby. Don't tell me what to do. Okay.
Too funny.
I have
Yeah.
another question for you too, Anna.
And it, you know, it's so frustrating, you know, and there's other people around, and you know, and sometimes I wonder if he does it just for attention, which obviously, you know, is something's happened, right, to him. But I just really was not sure how to handle that because we were so close to the road.
Right. Is there, like, do you often find that he tries to kind of get into power struggles with you? So if you tell him, he'll
Totally. Like he, you know, he wants everything his way. I want to cross the road here.
Right.
You know, so a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, and I mean it's tough when there's cars around, right?
Yeah.
But again, kind of looking under the water at the rest of kind of that behavioral iceberg. When you have kids who are oppositional in that way, so those are the kids who, if you say no, are like, you know what, no, like, don't tell me what to do, and will 110% bring it right back to you.
Right.
What we see on the behavior or on the surface is a kid being oppositional. What's going on more often than not, kind of without knowing more detail, but what's going on more often than not underneath kind of the surface of that behavioral iceberg is you have a child who is seeking opportunities for control. So again, kind of without knowing those details, think for a moment, you have a child who, even if the home environment has been traumatic, has some sort of familiarity or, comfort in that home, right? Because they're with parents or whomever. A child that's, social workers have gone in and done a removal. Prior to that removal, though, that child likely has had no control over what happens to them kind of in the ways of, abuse, right?
Right.
No control over their body, no control, no say over what happens to them, no control over being removed from, that familiarity that they know from their kind of home of origin, no control of where they've been placed. So no control in whom they're now staying with, as a caregiver, particularly if there's multiple if there's multiple homes, if there's been kind of multiple transitions, no control of when that happens, because it's normally the caregiver that initiates kind of that placement breakdown, right? So, and I mean, I could go on and on and on, but generally, our kids who are in care have no control, like just have no control in what's going on in their life. So you'll see very often for some of those kids who are a little bit more type A, they are going to do everything that they can to regain a sense of control. So we might see that behaviorally in that they're, make these what seem as kind of mundane kind of not ultimatums, but like mundane arguments where they're like, no, I want to cross here. I don't want to cross at the lights. So we see that kind of on the surface, but what's happening underneath is they're looking for that opportunity for control. So what I would do is kind of even expand outside of that behavior or that moment or that example and say, what then can we do to help develop that feeling of I have control within this situation, right? What can we do to help support that child and feeling like they have control, which is wonderful because we're going to be talking about that. But it's essentially what it is it's collaborative parenting, which is by, I think his name is Dr. Ross Greene. I read his book a couple of years back. I started doing it with my own child because that's my kid. And again, he doesn't have a trauma history, but he just likes to do things his way. So reading his book, it's like the collaborative parenting approach or whatever it's called, is to, it's all about supporting those kids. What can we do to, help that child feel that they have control within their life without actually fully giving them control in situations where it would be unsafe to do so.
Right. What was the author's name again? Sorry.
Dr. Ross Greene. I even think, give me one second. I even think I have the book. Maybe I don't. No, I've lent it out, but it's Dr. Ross Greene, Collaborative Parenting. And we'll talk about it a bit kind of moving forward.
Okay.
But essentially kind of what you're doing is giving controlled choice. So an example in that situation would be, you know what, like you have a choice. Crossing the street right here isn't safe. So your choice is, and then you would say the non-preferred. So we can sit here and wait, Or we can walk and cross at the lights and you can push the button and dangle like a little carrot, right?
Right.
As you're saying, setting a boundary, we can't do this because here are your choices, right? Your control choice. Here's the thing I'm going to make it non-preferred and make it like not fun. We'll just sit here and wait until you're ready. Or we can go cross the street at the lights and, you can push the button. You kind of make it fun and put that kind of preferred choice, the thing you kind of want him to do at the very end, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Thank you.
And again, that's kind of a patterned thing. Like it takes time. But honestly, I use it with my hubby. And he doesn't know, but it works. It's great. Like, and you can kind of generalize it across the board.
Anna, I do
Thank
have
you.
another question for you.
Okay.
A caregiver says, with all the knowledge of the pair of ACEs, neurodevelopment, the 3 R's, etc., thinking of children and teens transitioning to adoption or in the care of a relationship or family, are there guidelines that can be commonly shared with all of the players involved, like stages, steps, and approaches?
Is that with the child is being adopted into a new caregiver, like into a new caregiver home, or the child is being adopted into the caregiver's home that they've been in for some time?
David, maybe you can clarify your question for Anna.
Hi there.
Hi, David.
How are you? I was particularly looking at, transitioning with it to an adopted home, but also, I'm seeing a lot more of things changing. So it's going to care of family that they may have not had contact with, or
right.
even returning home to their biological parents.
Yeah.
And in that process, sometimes things talk about trauma or pacing is not always acknowledged or validated. And so I was wondering if there was any protocols that, give ideas around ages and timelines, flexibility, because some children require get there quick and others need to take their time. Is there something that is written in common language or protocols that can be shared, as opposed to you just pulling it out of your hat?
Yeah, that's a super good question, David. And to be honest, it's kind of the plight of my job right now. Though there are pockets that, kind of in that child's system that may have that trauma-informed lens, I would say that generally that lens isn't kind of across the board, right? It's not understood across the board. So, that's kind of one of the many systemic failures about child welfare that we could list. So kind of included in that, social workers may not have that lens. Medical staff, doctors, whomever may not have that lens. Therapeutic supports, counselors even may not have that lens. Schools certainly may not have that lens. So I wish I could say for sure, like, here's a format to kind of bring forward, that everybody kind of at that table would understand. But I think, to even when you're doing those transitions, to even have an ICM or like a transition meeting where everybody comes to the table, like that, realistically, like how often does that even happen, right? It's usually the child packs up and off they go and kind of in their transition. With that said though, as part of those transitions, whether it's to, an extended family member, or whether it's, reunification with parents, is there, the social workers hold a care plan. And what I would maybe encourage you to do is within kind of that child's file, the documentation around that child needs to be included in the file, right? So what I would maybe encourage you to do is, particularly now that you are, you're all on your way to becoming trauma-informed pros is you can do some of that advocacy work and just documenting, like writing in emails. Also kind of acknowledging who the people are, like if you can think of, you know, if we're thinking of a specific child, who kind of the key players are in that child's network who may have that lens, and, you know, do that kind of advocacy piece, because we know it doesn't happen inside the system very often. So what can we do to kind of advocate to have those other kind of key players come to the table with their information, right? I know that there's kind of behavior consultants that are across the island here on Vancouver Island. I can't speak to whether they all kind of have that trauma-informed lens or not, but I know that a lot of us are having a document called the Strengths and Strategies. So we will, when there's a transition, we will document all of the strengths that we know that that child carries. So that's their resiliency, and then we'll do strategies. So strategies for supporting the transition and strategies for supporting behavior. And that will move directly to the home that that child is placed with next, kind of in whatever context that placement is.
Might be a great...
I wish there was more I could say, but that's like, that's one of the huge gaps that you've just touched on. And again, it's kind of my plight now, but it's, I mean, how often do you know, get background information on a kid when they're brought to your home, let alone kind of like a detailed, you know, here's their trauma-informed support plan. Like, you know, it doesn't happen very often. So if at all. So,
yeah, often not,
yeah.
or it's negated. Might be a great presentation for you to pull together an idea and the guidelines for it.
Yeah, well, there's here in our office anyways, we do a resiliency and trauma-informed behavior support plan that's really entrenched in kind of all of this knowledge that we're sharing here. And we advocate quite hard to have those ICMs for transitions so that everybody comes to the table and we present that information. But I totally acknowledge that that's not typically the case. Yeah, it could be for sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Anna, did we want to take a quick little break before we move on? I'm just trying to be mindful of the time.
Yeah, super mindful. We've only got 10 more minutes and I've only made it like halfway through, hey?
Yeah, that's why I was thinking maybe we could, unless we just want to plow through it.
Well, let's go through one more slide and then we'll take a break. How's that? Just to kind of finish off the emotional regulation piece. I'm going to touch on this one really close, really quickly. But I just wanted to, or two slides, I guess. I just wanted to point out disassociation. And it's not often that we will see a child move into a place of disassociation, but sometimes for a kiddo who has experienced those, that kind of chronic developmental trauma, where a typical stress response, so fight, flight, or freeze, hasn't served them, right? It hasn't kept them safe. They've still been in that place of threat. What will happen is the brain's response then to protect itself will be to break away. The best way to understand it is it will break away from the body and go somewhere else. So you commonly see this, particularly in victims of, or survivors rather, language, and survivors of sexual assault, is while that assault is happening, their brain protecting itself, protecting kind of their personality, or protecting their spirit, being, I guess, yeah, their internal being, will be that it will, in essence, leave the body. It will completely check out from the experience that it's having kind of in that moment. So without getting into it super far, just kind of recognizing that sometimes if that's been that kid's experience, and that's been kind of their conditioned response, right? Their kind of defensive behavior, that's how they've protected themselves in the past. What you might see outside of that stress response is you might see a child who then instead disassociates. That means they check out, they're gone. Flat effect. They're not listening, or it comes across anyways, that they're not listening to you. They're not engaging with you. They're not hearing anything that you're saying. They're just gone. And a lot of the times we get that confused that they're ignoring us, right? And then we like get even more frustrated. But what's actually happening is they're their conditions response has been, nope, when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm just checking out. So just to be really mindful of that, if that is the case, we don't want to be coming in to try to like break that disassociation or bring them back in aggressive ways. The best way that I know to bring somebody out of that place of being disassociated is to, if we're sitting, I'll put my foot beside their foot. Or maybe I'll put my, hand gently on their arm, or I'll just kind of say their name and wait till they come out of it. And then to kind of do some of those grounding things like, Jane, you're safe, we're at home. So like, Jane, you're safe, you're at home, we're in your room, big, deep breaths, right? You won't come across that too often. That's, extreme abuse, but it does happen sometimes. So I wanted to bring that up. And kind of the last slide, supporting emotional regulation. I'm just going to pound through this one and then we can kind of decide what we want to do. But when we look at supporting emotional regulation, kind of looking at this image here, again, looking at for both ourselves and for our kiddos is, we have an experience that is our brain interacts with our environment, right? We're experiencing something and then we interpret that experience that we have, or we're interpreting that environment that we have. Therefore, we have a response to we have a response to that interpretation, right? And again, sometimes that response connects to the experience. So that's where we would understand a kid to be mad if, a sibling punched them in the face, right? Their interpretation of that experience is, I just got punched in the face. So my response is, I'm going to be mad and punch you back. Like that, we understand. Sometimes though, right, that response isn't going to connect to that experience. So that's that kid who has been triggered based on their past experiences, has moved into the flight or that stress response, and through their kind of brain's interpretation is feeling overwhelmed, right? The point to note on this though is we have that experience, interpretation, response. Then while we're responding to the way we interpret what's going on, we continue to have experiences, right? So we continue while we're in that kind of emotional state we continue to experience the environment around us, and then we continue to interpret the environment around us, and we continue to respond to the environment around us. So it's kind of like this cycle, right? We're kind of always taking cues from our environment. So looking at supporting emotional regulation, it's first, kind of important with our kiddos to, like I had mentioned earlier, to identify emotion. Your voice is really loud, or, your body is, shut down, or your body looks really angry, or you look really upset, right? And that's helping develop kind of that emotional capacity or that emotional intelligence is, I'm going to reflect back to you the emotion that I'm seeing you play out. And this is why I feel that you're feeling that emotion, because your body looks like this, your voice sounds like this, you're saying this. And then we're going to identify the kind of that strategy to regulate, right? So this is the, so those big body movements, or we're taking deep breaths, or we're, holding space and allowing them to kind of go through that process, or whatever that looks like. And again, if you're finding yourself being triggered, it's kind of stepping back and saying, you know what, I'm going to take a break because I'm really frustrated right now. I'll come back when I'm feeling calmer, right? And again, it's always super important to acknowledge and validate the feeling that our kiddos are going through, even if we don't understand it, even if we don't agree with it. Kind of that human experience is emotion, right? So we always want to acknowledge that emotions are valid. the other kind of piece with this too is when we're going through kind of these 3 R's, and this was touching on a bit, I think it was Judy who had mentioned it before, but I could be wrong. But we talked about kind of the importance of front loading too, right? So when that child is baseline saying, in our home, you know, hitting isn't okay. So, you know, when you're feeling frustrated and you're feeling angry, you know, as you're learning to not hit, what can we hit instead? We're going to front load kind of those expectations or front load those boundaries preventatively before the behavior occurs. But the bottom line is understanding that children and youth are going to react to your energy first before your words. So if you cannot in that moment model that regulation, you first need to take that break or do that breathing or whatever it is that you can do to calm yourself down. And then, you know, for some of us, acknowledging that we're not perfect, if you do become escalated, you do lose it, you do start yelling, you do speak out of turn, you do start whatever, the important part, and this is touching on what Judy was saying, the important part is coming back after and modeling to make things right. So that's taking that acknowledgement and saying, you know what, I lost my cool. I got really mad and I yelled at you and it was out of line and I'm sorry, right? And again, like as parents, we're going to apologize to our kids. Like they're the ones who threw the chair into the window first. Why am I apologizing to them? But again, we're modeling the behavior that we want to see. We're modeling that emotional intelligence, and we're modeling through, you know, kind of talking the talk and walking the walk, what we're expecting to see and hoping to see and hoping to teach our kiddos kind of as we move forward. Looking at attachment. So attachment is our ability to bond and form relationship with others. For our kiddos, it can be assumed that all of our kiddos come to our homes with attachment wounds. So that means that there has been disruption to their attachment, and that wound in their attachment, in their kind of ability to form relationship will certainly manifest kind of through their behaviors. So attachment is that deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. Looking at kind of attachment theory, which we're going to be getting into, is it explains how the parent-child relationship emerges and influences subsequent development. Just a heads up, this is kind of, we're not going to get into it, but this is, you know, if you get into attachment theory, it's kind of like going into the vortex because you look at yourself and you look at the way that you interact with people in your world, and it all connects to your childhood. And I'm not a super Freudian person, but this is very much, you see how your attachment kind of relationship when you were younger plays out in your adult relationships now. Okay, so I think that this will work now. Let me know that you.
The attachment theory argues that a strong emotional and physical bond to one primary caregiver in our first years of life is critical to our development. If our bonding is strong and we are securely attached, then we feel safe to explore the world. We know that there is always that safe base which we can return to any time. If our bond is weak, we feel insecurely attached. We are afraid to leave or explore a rather scary-looking world because we are not sure if we can return. People who are securely attached are said to have greater trust, can connect to others, and as a result are more successful in life. Insecurely attached people tend to mistrust others, lack social skills, and have problems forming relationships. There is one type of secure attachment, and there are 3 types of insecure attachments: anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and anxious disorganized. In responses to distress, the first 3 react organized, while the last acts disorganized. To understand the theory better, Let's look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who have 4 children, Luca, Anne, Joe, and Amy. The Smiths are lovely parents who cuddle, make frequent eye contact, speak warmly, and are always there for their kids. But one day, Mr. Smith falls very sick and dies. For Mrs. Smith, life now becomes very difficult. She spends all day working, while at the same time trying to care for her children. An impossible task. At 6 years of age, Luca's brain is for the most part developed, his character strong and his worldview shaped. The new situation does not affect him much. He knows there is still always Mum, his safe haven. He feels securely attached. Later, he turns into a trusting and optimistic young man. His self-image is positive. Anne, who is 3, has problems coping with the new lack of attention. To Anne, her mother now acts unpredictably. She is anxious about their relationship and as a result becomes clingy. To get her mum's attention, she has to raise her emotional state and scream. When her mum finally reacts with a predictable response, she herself acts ambivalent and doesn't show her true feelings. Later in life, others think Anne is unpredictable or moody. Her self-image is less positive. Her attachment style is anxious ambivalent. 2-year-old Joe spends his days with his uncle, who loves him, but thinks that a good education means being strict. If little Joe shows too much emotion or is too loud, his uncle gets angry and sometimes punitive. This scares Joe. He learns that to avoid fear, he has to avoid showing his feelings, also in other situations. As an adult, he continues this strategy and has problems entering relationships. His image of himself is rather negative. His attachment is anxious avoidant. Amy, who is just 1 year old, gets sent to a nursery. The staff there is poorly trained, overworked, and often very stressed. Some are outright abusive. Amy therefore becomes anxious of the very people she seeks security from, a conflict which totally disorganizes her ideas about love and safety. As she is experiencing fear without resolution, she tries to avoid all social situations. As an adult, she thinks of herself as unworthy of love. Her self-image is very negative. Her attachment is anxious, disorganized. Our attachment is formed in the very first years of our lives, a time when we are too young to communicate our anxiety and as a result can experience high levels of stress. Then our adrenal gland, an organ sitting on top of our kidneys, produces the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure goes up, and we become alert. If that happens frequently, it is called toxic stress. Toxic because it impairs the development of a child's brain and weakens the immune system. In embryos or at a very young age, toxic stress can even switch the expressions of genes, which can affect our health many decades later.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there, just mindful of the time. But I think the point is from that is to understand that the way that our needs are responded to, the way that our needs are met by or not met by our primary caregivers in early childhood greatly influence, not define, but greatly influence our ability to form attachment or relationship with others as we move forward through childhood into adulthood. So an example of that, looking at the image on the left side of your screen at attachment styles is, if you have a mother who, when a child, let's say, falls and is crying, is quick and sensitive and consistent in how to respond to that child's needs. I'm going to come pick you up. I'm going to hug you. I'm going to make you feel better. Or when you're hungry and you're saying you're hungry, I'm going to go and I'm going to make you food, right? Those are just some examples of how kind of the needs are met in that kind of quick and attuned way, attuned being the key word. Then the child then becomes secure, right? They believe and they understand that their needs will be met. Therefore, they feel confident to kind of explore their environment or their surroundings, and they're happy, right? And as an adult, that child has developed the belief that their needs will be met. They trust that others can meet their needs, right? Then if we look at ambivalent attachment, you don't need to know the names of these. Attachment is like a master's program, and I'm trying to plug it in 10 minutes. So pick and choose what you choose to retain. But ambivalent attachment happens when a mother is inconsistent. So sometimes that, or mother or primary caregiver, it shouldn't just say mother, but when that primary caregiver is inconsistent in that sometimes they may be attuned and sensitive to that child's needs. Sometimes they may be neglectful to that child's needs. So for example, that may be a parent who is a binge drinker, right? When they're sober, they're attuned, they're there, they're available to meet that child's needs. But when they're binging, the child is plugged into the other room, and when, kind of their binge is over, they're, hungover splayed out on the couch. That's kind of that inconsistency as an example. So what happens then is that child becomes anxious or insecure that their needs are going to be met because their needs have been met inconsistently. So I don't know, are my needs going to be met this time, or are they not going to be met this time? And that child typically becomes really angry, right? That's the kid that's like, you know what, like, I'm worth having my needs met, and I'm mad that you're not there and available to support me when I need you to be there. So what happens is that develops into this belief that I can't rely on other people to meet my needs. So I'm just going to do it myself. So those are, those people such as myself that become ultra independent as adults, right? I don't need you. I'm not going to rely on anybody else. I'm certainly not going to ask anybody for help. As a trauma response, I'm now ultra independent. I'm my own isolated being, and I like other people, but I'm never going to rely on other people to meet my needs. Now moving on to disorganized attachment. So actually I'm going to go up to avoidant first. So this is where you have the primary caregiver is distant or disengaged. So this is the caregiver that kind of, for whatever reason, and there's a spectrum of reasons, but this is the caregiver that is not acting as a caregiver. They're not parenting. So this is where you'll see, particularly in sibling groups, the eldest, in lieu of that caregiver being the caregiver, the caregiver or the eldest in a sibling group will become the parent. They're the ones who will be, making meals or bathing kids. They're the ones who will be, pulling out homework. Like they'll have taken on that kind of parental role. What happens to a child when their primary caregiver is distant or disengaged, so they're not attuned to a child's needs, is that child becomes kind of fearful of their environment in the sense that they're not very explorative of anything, and that they become emotionally distant. So if my primary caregiver, is not engaged with me and not checking into me and not attuned to my emotions, I'm just not going to show my emotions, because showing my emotion and being emotionally vulnerable doesn't help get my needs met, right? So what happens is that experience developed into this subconscious belief that my needs probably aren't going to get met by other people. So I'm going to be very wary of being vulnerable when expressing that I have a need. And then kind of the last one, and we see this quite often. It's probably the most common attachment style that we see with kiddos in our care. is disorganized attachment. So that's when we see a primary caregiver acts in ways that are like really extreme, explosive, behaviorally, that frighten the child or are frightening for the child. And what happens is when a child has a need and the caregiver responds in a frightening way, again, you see this often with physical abuse, emotional, sexual abuse. You see it with, parents who have a substance misuse disorders. There's that unpredictability quite often. There's that kind of huge emotional explosion or even passiveness that comes with that. What you'll see then is that child becomes depressed or passive or fawning. Again, that stress response, fawning. I don't want to trigger you, so I'm just going to be quiet and step on eggshells over here in the corner. Or they'll become angry or kind of like non-responsive, the kid that gets so mad and they don't want to talk about it. They don't want anything to, after, once you've calmed them down, they're shut down. They're totally closed off to being vulnerable with how they're feeling. What happens then is as that child grows into a teen and then into adulthood is they become really incredibly confused and have no kind of strategy to have their needs met. So they don't trust others to be able to care for their needs, but they also don't have any idea of how to meet their own needs at the same time too. So, a lot of people will knee jerk and say, oh, this kid has reactive attachment disorder and, they're disrupting any type of relationship. But, kind of before even going into that place, which is a serious designation, what we commonly kind of misdiagnose as RAD is that kind of disorganized attachment. So what will that look like is, now looking at the right image, is a child who has that kind of secure attachment will be content and engaged and kind of focused. A child that has an avoidant attachment will be kind of, more withdrawn or quiet or anxious, like almost kind of come across as fearful or shy. A child that has that ambivalent attachment will be anxious, not focused, insecure, add a lot of questions. So they're constantly needing reassurance, right? Constantly needing kind of that emotional reassurance from you. A child that has that disorganized attachment will be angry, depressed. They're not following directions, or they're kind of seen as that oppositional, again, really short fused, quick to anger, challenges with making friends because they don't know kind of that social engagement piece. When I went into learning about attachment, let me tell you, I came out of that and was like, my poor hubby, I came out of that and was like, well, now I understand why you're such a complex human being. You have this attachment style. He was so mad. So what do we do then to support the attachment styles, knowing that, even a simple removal from the home disrupts attachment, on top of those traumatic experiences that our kiddos have had? We know that no child comes into care with secure attachment, right? And then, statistically, the more a child is transitioned to new caregiver homes, so the more a child has experienced the placement breakdown and is moved or transitioned into a new caregiver home, the more likely that will continue to happen. That's why you see those kids, that are 16, 17, that have had multiple huge over the top numbers of placements over the years. It's because they've had this significantly disrupted attachment, right? Disorganized attachment. Caregivers are seeing it as these huge, massive behavioral issues, but what's happening is because that attachment style has been, or those attachment wounds rather, are so deep because that relationship has been disrupted again and again and again and again so many times that that child comes across as being self-sabotaging, right? So then the question becomes, what can we do to support attachment, understanding that, you know, supporting and caring for kiddos with a trauma history is, you know, a marathon, not a race. What can we do? We can build a home that is safe, secure, and consistent, that helps develop an attuned relationship with the kids that we have. So that's kind of starting with that secure base, right? So again, that's kind of that safety and being consistent in providing that safety. You know, be accepting of the child, kind of moving up the scaffolded home, be accepting of the child. I see you're, again, kind of from the behavior place, I see you're feeling this way. I know it's tough. You know, I know a lot's happened to you to bring you to this place. And I acknowledge, you know, I acknowledge the person that you are, and I acknowledge the resiliency that's even got you to this place, right? Again, be curious, understanding that child's feelings, you know, what's going on for you when they're feeling angry or when they're, you know, punching holes in the wall, and being empathetic, maintaining that empathetic kind of attuned feeling with them. Helping that child to experience kind of that family atmosphere by maintaining kind of that positive emotional rhythm. So, you know, as a family unit within our home, we have, you know, emotional outbursts, but like in general, because we have that ability to co-regulate and support one another, in general, our emotional kind of rhythm within the home is pretty baseline and positive, right? We're going to do, you know, reattunement after kids kind of have that emotional, kind of go through that emotional peak and then kind of come down. I'm always going to bring you back into the fold. I'm not going to neglect the emotion. I'm not going to be punitive for the emotion. I'm not going to ignore you for the emotion. I'm always going to do whatever I can within my own capacity to bring you back in and to reestablish that attuned rapport with you. Structure, again, a huge thing, particularly with our kiddos that have that trauma history and that disrupted attachment. The more that they can predict, you know, the more that they can predict what's going to happen in the home, the more secure they're going to feel. So that's predicting, you know, either routine or structure through the day, right? To predicting and knowing that, you know, you're going to respond to their emotions or you're going to respond to the behaviors in a certain way. And again, that's being kind of that safe, healthy, and consistent home for them. That choice and logical consequences, which I see might be something worthwhile kind of getting into for that next session. So having that controlled choice and having those kind of naturally built-in consequences. Natural consequences are the best because they're not on you, right? So kids can't get mad at you for natural consequences. The natural consequences are an outcome of choices that they've made, which is where this collaborative parenting is golden. And then, you know, kind of helping to manage that child's behavior kind of and support. And, you know, kind of at the end of the day, again, it's regulate. So I forget if it's Mahatma Gandhi or whoever, whatever, I'm not sure who kind of said that quote, but literally, you know, that kind of importance in walking the walk, not just talking the talk, right? Which is the hardest part of caregiving. So this is typically where we would have taken a break. I think that next session, I'm not going to get into the executive functioning piece, as that's something that more often comes up within the school, and the school's responsible for caring for. But if you just want to take a look through your slides and read over it, it is important to note just in that it can help you develop kind of even more context to some of kind of those neurodevelopmental impacts on the brain that impact behavior. Executive functioning is a pretty big one, but again, it's usually at the point where executive functioning is caught and supported within the schools more often than not, right? So before we wrap up, just a quick example of a partner breathing exercise. So this is a really great exercise to do for co-regulation. And again, you know, you're going to have to model it or tweak it based on kind of the developmental age of the kiddo that you have. But an example would be if we were all in the same room together, is I would ask you to turn, you know, to a partner, to somebody beside you. Given that we're on Zoom, I'll just use the example that what that'll look like is using my son. When I see him kind of going through that emotional piece, I'll reach out my hand to him and I'll be like, you know, you're really feeling upset right now. And I'll say, place your hand on my hand. And he'll put his hand over top. So when his hand is over top of mine, without any language, what I'll do is I'll breathe in 4 counts. And as I breathe in, I'll raise my hand up as I inhale. So I'll go, and then I'll hold it. And then I'll breathe out for the same 4 counts. I'll continue to do that. And what that does, that breathing in through the nose for 4 counts, pausing, and then breathing out through the mouth for 4 counts, that deep breathing, is it soothes and calms the parasympathetic nervous system. So it literally calms the stress response. It's a signal to the brain through those deep breaths to calm that stress response. And the other nice thing is, if you do have that ability or relationship with your kiddo, if you do the hand on hand, you're maintaining that therapeutic relationship. You're maintaining that touch. If your kid is unable to do that for whatever reason, I mean, a teen isn't going to be like, okay, let me put my hand on your hand, right? You know, you could either have the hands separated, or you can just sit there, right? Just sit there and hold space and breathe in and breathe out. And I always do that. I mean, you do it as long as needed. I always do a minimum 4 times, but you do it as long as needed until things kind of hit baseline. So kind of wrapping up. Whoop, whoop. Again, just a reminder that the trauma has happened in a relationship. The trauma our kiddos have experienced have happened within a relationship. So therefore, the healing must also then happen in relationship. And that, as caregivers, is our most influential role. Right? We have the primary relationship with our kiddos. So then our responsibility then to our kiddos is to do what we can to support that relationship, right? Or to support the work that they're doing on their healing journey through that relationship that we have with them as caregivers. Are there any final thoughts? Any kind of questions, any comments before we move forward, before we end?
Hi, Anna, that slide with the house on it, I have never seen that before. That is awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That is terrific. Yeah,
it's a really good one. I got kind of overwhelmed at the idea of having to explain attachment theory, because like I said, it's a master's program and it can be really confusing, right? So I saw that and I was like, perfect, a really easy kind of, again, scaffolded visual to kind of help you understand that within your home, these kind of ideas can be used as guiding principles in supporting that secure attachment. So thanks for pointing that out, Judy, because I was like, oh my God, how do I explain this? Well, thank you all for your time today. I'm sorry that we went over. I appreciate you sticking through an extra half hour with me. I'm not going to be going over the executive function next week. So take a look over that. If you feel like you have any questions, I'll put my contact in the chat. So you feel free to email me or give me a call and I can go into more detail on any of it with you. Otherwise, next session we'll be looking at building and supporting resiliency and supporting that kind of higher cortical brain. And we'll touch a little bit on supporting the universal needs, which are some of the other slides that we missed within the session.
Oh, perfect. That sounds great. Thank you everyone so much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Save your link so that you'll be able to jump back in.